Okay, so our group is doing pesticides exposure, and I'm Leslie. These are references. For the overview, basically pesticides are substances or chemicals used to repel or kill pests. This can be animals or weed. Most pesticides are used in farm or agricultural life. Um, these are used to protect products from being taken over or eaten by other animals. There are three main ones used: the herbicides, which is for weed control. The second one is to kill insects, and the third one is to kill off fungi. And generally, people are not really exposed to pesticides just because there are very low doses in the pesticides that most people are exposed to. And the problem arises when there's a constant exposure, which is mostly people that work in farms and handle direct pesticides. Those that work in fields are constantly exposed and are at greater risks, and with these risks come bigger side effects.
Okay, I'm Haley. Farm workers are the foundation of the United States food system, and there's an estimated 2.4 million farm workers in the United States alone. There's very low pay and dangerous conditions for farm workers, and they're excluded from many legal protections as well. They're also vulnerable due to exploitations, such as language differences, origins, race, and socioeconomic status. Also to note, farm workers are not farmers. They don't own a farm. They just are hired to work the farm. And without farmers, we would not have most of our agriculture. And so the U.S. agricultural system depends a lot on pesticides. And pesticides use poses a serious health risk to farm workers and their families. So such as direct exposure and from environmental or residual exposure. And long-term dose exposure is linked to cancers, neurological disease, and reproductive harm, etc. And with the rising heat from climate change, there is an increase in pesticide use. And with this being said, the human body is more vulnerable to toxic compounds when under heat stress, and that this connects to climate change. So going into safety education and perceived safety. Pesticides are a major source of occupational injury and illness, like I said, and many farm workers believe pesticides are not dangerous in that they wouldn't use chemicals if they would harm humans, and very few farm workers are aware of long-term consequences of pesticide exposure. And going into the training, the safety protocols, training programs for safety education has not been fully evaluated. So according to Environmental Protection Agency workers, protection standard has not been properly assessed through direct data from farm workers themselves, and the education material given usually tells farm workers what to do and not tell them why these actions reduce risk to pesticide exposure. And a quote that I got from my article by Curry says, "The ability of farm workers to engage in safe practices depend upon their ability to communicate with their employer, and there's power relationships at work, and the availability of protective equipment." So yeah, and then you can go next one. So here I have my table, and the table shows the ones who believe your health is hurt by pesticides here. About 76% of people express some concern or enough to worry a great deal that their health would be hurt by pesticides. And the highest concern was 46% who believe farm workers' ability to have children is hurt by pesticides. And that just shows they do have concern that pesticide exposure is there. And then on table 3, we can see the scale items of the safety precautions that they could take, and whether they have control or no control. So many workers have said they have felt that they have no control in avoiding harmful effects or maintaining safe practices. So you could see that here in the percentage and the number of people. So for example, 37.1% said they feel as they had no control in wearing clothes that protect you from harmful effects of pesticides. and only a small percent felt as if they did have a great deal of control here, and that was between around 2.7% to 15.1%.
My name is Naya, and my case study is on the cohort study, which happened in 2022 to 2023. It took place in Zagreb, Croatia. And the research was aimed to create realistic recommendations for reducing pesticide exposure in children. And the purpose was to see how many households clean fruits and vegetables before eating them. So the research studied 459 families plus their sons around the age of 11. And from their study, 97% had washed their produce with mainly just water, while 60 and up didn't peel their fruits or vegetables with edible skins, while others just used water and soap, vinegar, or lemon juice, salt water, and baking soda. For my graph, it shows all the methods of like what they use, like water, baking soda, salt water, the vinegar and lemon juice, and then water and dish soap. And gray being the fruits for each method, and then the black being for the vegetables. So from their study, they showed the do's and don'ts based off how many people actually did clean their fruits and vegetables. So washing all produce instead of soaking them in water is more beneficial to reduce pesticides. Peeling and removing outside layers of the multiple fruits can leave or get rid of the residues. Vinegar and baking soda is useful, but they still put that under just using water. And foods like apples, pears, cucumbers, and zucchini should mainly be peeled, as in peeling the other fruits and vegetables can remove the vitamins, dietary fibers, and trace elements. And the don'ts is that assuming organic means it's pesticide free. Using soaps can be harmful, and in the study it reported that the United States Food and Drug Administration said that these fruits and vegetables can absorb the chemicals through their skin, leading to gut problems.
There are some health correlations with neurological disorders that they have found. While pesticides are vital for agricultural life, there are really big side effects, especially for those who handle them, which can lead to significant problems like neurological development or disorders like Alzheimer's or Parkinson's disease. Children as well as pregnant women are at high risk, as it is impaired detoxification and blood-brain barrier function. And in third world countries, there's a bigger problem because unauthorized pesticides are more available and they can contaminate their environment. Some evidence, there's several journals that state these facts, and there's also several studies that include how pesticides have led to neurological disorders or just in general setbacks. And the big neurological disorder that they have found is Alzheimer's disease, especially for those that are at the farm or live around farm life. And there's it's not just this one, but there's different ones for each neurological disorder that they have found. So this graph basically represents a study done in China of how it affected farm workers and their nervous system. And this is one of the highest pesticides that was affected, and this was used for weeds, which makes sense because that is one of the most used pesticides.
Hi, my name is Bella, and I'll be talking about who was affected. So in my article, it talks about how Latinx immigrant children in the United States are highly impacted, and that non-farm worker children showed pesticide exposure, with rural farm worker children being more exposed to organophosphate pesticides, which is commonly used in agriculture, and then urban non-farm worker children being more exposed to organochlorine and pectoroid pesticides, which is found in homes and neighborhoods. And then exposure often occurs being wherever you're located or the type of work that your parents do. And there's factors that increase your vulnerability, which include low household income, crowded housing, or your parents working in hazardous industries, or limited access to healthcare and environmental protection. And the study highlights that Latinx immigrant children, regardless of where they live, they face a disproportionately higher exposure due to environmental and housing conditions, limited access to health protections, and parents' occupation. So barriers that are faced is health and safety risks. Being increased exposure to extreme heat leads to heat stress, illness, and even sometimes death. And pesticide exposure causes short and long-term health problems such as cancer, diabetes, and reproductive issues. And then heat and pesticides together can be more dangerous when combined. And then next is lack of legal protection, because farmers are excluded from many labor laws, which protects them from minimum wage, overtime pay, and rights to organize. And there's no federal heat protection standards, which makes it dangerous. And then pesticide safety regulations are weak and often not enforced. And then moving on to poor working conditions, farm work includes long hours and hard labor with low pay under very bad conditions, and protective clothing that is needed for farm work is, and pesticide safety increases with overheating. And then lastly, the systemic inequality is many farm workers are immigrants from marginalized communities, making them more vulnerable to exploitation. And then there's historic racism and exclusion in labor laws that includes to affect their rights. So here is my graph that explains the distribution of pesticide exposure incidents in the US, and this is from the National Pesticide Information Center. So the highest, if you see here, the largest share of pesticide exposure is in inhalation at 43%, and it's from breathing in fumes, sprays, or dust, and it can lead to respiratory problems or other health problems. And then the second one at 21% is dermal, which is a common type that happens through skin contact. And then for the next one, which is ingestion at 14%, about 1 in 7 cases involve swallowing pesticides. And then there is exposure possible, where there's a chance of possible pesticide contact, but it wasn't confirmed. And then there is unknown, where cases couldn't be classified, and there's a small percentage of ocular and occupational, where pesticide can go through your eyes, or occupational is like depending on the workforce.
I'm Rowan, and this is who is disproportionately affected. So, higher quality foods that have little to no pesticides, so they're organic, or they're mostly organic or just have higher quality, they are more expensive, which in turn makes them less accessible to lower income people. And Black children in urban areas may face disproportionate exposure to pesticides, which causes an increase in health problems like asthma. And there's a study that I'm going to quote that has to do with the people disproportionately affected in Maryland, which is a heavily or predominantly African American population. Chlorpyrifos are a pesticide found in food that increase the odds of getting asthma, but thankfully they are now actually banned in most countries. Lower income people and racial minorities are disproportionately affected by pesticides because, again, as I said, it's more expensive to buy food that are not affected or have pesticide use. So, the study that was done in Maryland with around about 90-something% of the population being African American showed consistent, positive, significant associations were observed between the chlorpyrifos biomarker, TCPY, which is a metabolite of the chlorpyrifos, and asthma symptoms. So basically what this means is that there was some findings that did show there is a correlation between all these things causing asthma when they're in the food. So urinary concentrations of the test subjects were found to have TCPY, and what happened was the TCPY in these urinary concentrations are associated with an increased odds of coughing, wheezing, chest tightness, and these are all symptoms of asthma. And there was actually a 10-fold increase of the TCPY and AMPA, which is another metabolite of the chlorpyrifos, that do increase the odds of the coughing, the chest tightness, and the wheezing by about 60 to 50%. This is what the study showed. So it's statistically significant and actually hurting people's health. And among the predominantly black children with asthma, this study found that evidence that chlorpyrifos are in fact associated with an increase of asthma morbidity. Pesticides also affect young people too, in a way you actually may not be aware of, and that is suicide. Because the pesticides actually are used as a way to kill yourself for young people in low-income developing countries. So the young people will take the pesticide and drink it to kill themselves. So as we can see here on this graph, when these pesticides were actually banned in China, these are just the 2 years, not the overall count, we see here that the suicide rates actually go down in young people. So we can see here, this is before the pesticide was banned, this yellow line. Now this is when the pesticide is banned. So same trend, right, between the ages, but the overall count is actually lower and the rate is lower. This is also another graph showing it of women who are killing themselves in Sri Lanka, and the rate is much lower, as you can see, when the pesticides were actually banned. So you can see the 2 years between 1982, 84, and 2010 and 2012. The rates of suicide were substantially decreased too within this age population of 17 to 20 to 41 and 45. And you can see with males, it was less of a decrease because men overall have a high rate of suicide, but it still actually did cause a statistically significant decrease in suicides. Also for pesticide, suicides are also decreased in India, as you can see for women and also men. So you can see here and over there as well. So with all of these things being said, I think it's important to realize that while pesticides do cause health issues for people, they can actually be used in other harmful ways to affect people. So if we ban them or restrict them, it'll impact public health in a positive way overall. Less harmful effects and also less suicides. And we have a question for you. How do you think pesticides impact both human health and the surrounding environment over time? And what steps do you think can be taken to reduce pesticide exposure while protecting crops from the pests? Thank you.